Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. It's about time that we go back to True Crime Rocket Science, and that is what we're going to do in this episode. I've heard quite a lot of creators just absolutely mystified that they can't imagine that Chris Watts would have or could have committed this crime himself alone. And many of these creators have got a huge following. There are a lot of people who feel the same, that Chris Watts didn't have it in him to do something like this. Someone had to have been pushing him. Someone had to have been goading him. Someone else had to have been assisting him. And in a weird way, that thinking isn't completely wrong. It's kind of on the right track, but it sort of terminates kind of at the wrong place, right? So in this episode, I'm going to share with you the operative psychology that's going to help you understand the kind of inexplicable. So a lot of you just don't understand Chris Watts. A lot of you feel that he wasn't capable of doing this. This episode is going to challenge that thinking, and it's going to show you, it's certainly going to lead you some of the way to seeing the missing link in Chris Watts's criminal psychology. Worth playing for. Now, a big reason why many people who are not used to true crime, who are not very familiar with it, think that you can just apply normal psychology to these cases, and you can't. Criminals don't think the way that we think, although their original thinking starts off the same way ours starts off. I always say in my books and in my blogs, and pretty often I say that all murderers are liars, but not all liars are murderers. And so what that shows you is lying is certainly part of the psychology that leads you to committing a crime like this. It's not just the ease and the familiarity with sort of lying to other people. It's also being able to lie to yourself, being deluded, being delusional, being caught up in a delusion, being caught up in a fairy tale. Now, this can be quite a complicated concept, so I'm going to make it as simple as I can. So let me just give you a little bit of backstory to it. A couple of years ago, I wrote a book on mass killers, and I was kind of astonished because I thought it was going to be a very, very difficult subject, and in some ways it is difficult. But what surprised me was that the psychology of all mass killers was very, very similar. And what that then also showed me, I sort of made a breakthrough, I felt, in true crime, that I discovered basically two ingredients that basically predict whether a normal person is likely or susceptible or has the propensity or has the sort of aggravating circumstances that is going to make a crime either likely or inevitable or kind of just a matter of time. Right? Now, I know a lot of you won't like to hear that, because when you hear that, it sort of sounds like we all have it in us to be like Chris Watts. We all have evil in us. We all have evil capacities. We all have evil thoughts. We all have the potential to do the unmentionable, the unfathomable. Right? We don't like to think that. And in this episode, I'm going to show you why that is the case. Before we get there, if you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, please do like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So let me define for you just very briefly these two key ingredients that I discovered. Now, let me also be quite clear. There is a broad link between mass shooters or mass killers and Chris Watts, in the sense that a mass shooter is defined as somebody who commits 4 crimes, 4 murders in short succession. So that is the definition: 4 or more people in a small geographic proximity over a short period of time. That's the definition of mass murder. Now, as soon as the time is lengthened and the geographical distance is also lengthened, then it becomes something more akin to serial killer, like the Ripper, right? Now, you could kind of make the argument that Chris Watts committed mass murder when he killed his wife, his 2 children, and his unborn son. That's 4 individual lives that he killed. And so you could actually argue that the psychology that I discovered researching mass murder actually is a perfect fit for Chris Watts. On the other hand, you could say, well, he only killed 3 people. The unborn child doesn't count. And so doesn't quite meet that definition. It depends on how anal you want to be about it. And being anal is something we're going to deal with as part of these ingredients. So first of all, what I want to just highlight is sadism, right? So sadism is very typical of these mass murders, these mass killers. If you think about Sandy Hook and the amount of people that were killed, a lot of these young guys, and it is often young men, go out in what they think is going to be a blaze of glory. They're going to be remembered in terms of their insignificance as people, that is being inverted in this big show of gratuitous violence, and everyone's going to remember what they did. Everyone's going to remember their name, kind of thing. But ultimately, that act is sadistic. They get the benefit of whatever you want to call it, notoriety, infamy, the world knowing their name, them being on television or something like that, after they've passed, and that is what they want. But I want to define it just more specifically, that sadism, in terms of the dictionary, is the tendency to derive pleasure, especially sexual gratification, from inflicting pain, suffering, or humiliation on others. So you can go through all of these mass shooters and look at how they do derive pleasure from what they're doing. It's kind of bloody revenge. And a really good example of that is the Isla Vista killer, Elliot Rodger, who some of the victims even said he was laughing, smiling as he was shooting and driving over people. Pretty horrible thing to kind of imagine. Now, in terms of the Chris Watts case, it's slightly different. You could even argue very different. But let me read that definition again and see if you can apply it in your mind and fill in the missing link in your mind to the criminal psychology at work here, okay? So the definition of sadism is a tendency to derive pleasure, especially sexual gratification, from inflicting pain, suffering, or humiliation on others. So this is what I want you to think about. Chris Watts, according to the true crime rocket science theory, is he killed his entire family so that he could be with Kissinger. But what are we actually talking about? So that he could sleep with Kissinger whenever he wanted to, so that he didn't have to babysit his children, he didn't have to worry about his wife calling, he didn't have to worry about a divorce, he didn't have to worry about alimony. So the actual crime was actually committed to allow himself full unfettered sexual access to Kissinger. He was enjoying that in the 5 weeks before he went to North Carolina. Then it was interrupted. He really didn't enjoy that. And then it was sort of intermittent in the weekend that Shanann was away. And he wanted to take away all the barriers to that. And so what did he do? In order to get the sexual gratification, he murdered his entire family. So he's doing something in order to derive pleasure. He's doing something, he's inflicting pain, suffering, and humiliation on his family in order that he can derive pleasure, in this case sexual gratification. You can also put it in another way, that he is, when he, and I don't really like to talk in this way because it's just a horrible thing to think about, but he talks about the way that Shanann was buried and being buried face down, and you kind of get the sense that he had a sense of satisfaction in inflicting that kind of humiliating end finish line for Shanann, if I can put it that way. In other words, I think there was a sense of satisfaction that is where he was putting her, and the same with his children. Although he claims that it was a horrible thing that he did, I think there was some sense of, he's getting rid of his children, and maybe I don't know exactly how he was thinking about his poor little girls, but I do think he felt quite humiliated by them repeating some of the things their mother was saying to him, and I also think that the whole thing about chicken nuggets he didn't enjoy. And when I'm saying this, I'm not kind of on his side saying you were right to feel that way. I'm simply saying this is how the criminal psychology, this unacceptable, debaucherous, really despicable mental programming, where this was taking him. I'm simply retracing that and showing you how it comes together. And so what I've shown you here is part of the puzzle, and I've kind of given you a little bit of a hint as to how it sort of works. And we've seen it in a little way through the children, in terms of the children, him feeling probably to some extent humiliated by his children. And you might not like that. You might say, no, I don't think that is true. If that's the case, then you're not going to be able to establish this missing link. So in other words, if you argue against the fact that he felt humiliated, then it's not, this whole psychology is not going to work for you. So if you feel that way, I wouldn't really listen any further if I were you, because it's just not going to make sense to you, and you're going to argue against it. And that brings us to the other side of it, which is, did he feel humiliated by Shanann? And I think he did. I think he felt, it's not humiliated necessarily in the sense of someone insulting you to your face, or someone purposefully necessarily making fun of you. But I think there was a lot of humiliation over a long period of time, and it was something that he found more and more intolerable. And I'm not saying that Shanann was trying to be nasty to him, or that Shanann was intending to humiliate him, just that is how he experienced it. So on Facebook, for example, quite a few times she would say things about him and he didn't like it. That doesn't mean Shanann was doing it intentionally. There was also an incident where she would sort of playfully make fun of him, and you can definitely make the argument that he should have said to her, please don't do that again, and that was then his responsibility. But he wasn't that kind of guy. He wanted to go with the flow, and eventually this humiliation piled up and piled up. I don't really think the Facebook was the full story. I don't think the sense of humiliation was just from Facebook, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And with this, we need to go into a whole nother dimension, and as soon as you go into it, people will be quick to say, oh, you're victim blaming. You're saying Shanann deserved to die and it's all Shanann's fault. That's not what we're saying. We're saying this is how his psychology worked, and these were the factors that played into that. So let me just go back to the research that I did into slaughter, and I'll put a link to that book in the description. I covered the Aurora shooter, the Tsarnaev brothers, that's in terms of the Boston bombing, Nicholas Cruz, the Sandy Hook killer, and so on. Also the guy the Vegas shooter, Stephen Paddock. So I covered all of them. And so what I found invariably in almost all of these cases, when I say almost all, it's virtually without exception that they feel themselves humiliated. And you may think, wow, I don't see that. Like, I just don't see, for example, Stephen Paddock, how did he feel humiliated? And what you find invariably is that for whatever reason, humiliation might be the wrong word. It might be that they feel insignificant, socially insignificant. They may feel themselves social outcasts. They may feel themselves social failures. But it's within their context, not within your context, not within what you think. And so if you apply that to Chris Watts and say, well, how is he humiliated? And I'm the first person to say, yes, I don't really see that. And in the beginning, I must say when the crime happened, I thought, wow, there's a lot of sadism here. There's definitely a high proportion of sadism in this crime. And also in the way that when he gave the sermon on the porch, There is almost a sense of glee and of satisfaction, right? Now, so the question was, so where does the humiliation come from? And you couldn't say that Chris Watts was humiliated at work. You couldn't say that Chris Watts was humiliated at school, although to some extent there's something there. Like, he didn't have a lot of girlfriends at school. But again, it's not enough, is it? And so you've got to ask, where's this humiliation coming from? And so I think some of it had to do with the problem with his parents, that his parents couldn't attend his wedding. I don't know how you would feel, but I would feel quite humiliated by that. If, for whatever reasons, for whoever's fault it was, your parents don't attend your own wedding. And then I think another thing, like, you go and visit your parents, but you can't actually even see them. You've traveled to another state to visit your parents, but you're not really, well, not that he couldn't see them, but he couldn't see them with his children, right? And so that, I think, made him feel humiliated, diminished, insignificant. But on a day-to-day basis, I think what it actually came down to was OCD, right? And if you want to know what obsessive compulsive disorder is, it's basically an effort to control. And I know I've had a lot of pushback from people who say Shanann didn't even have OCD. I believe that both Chris Watts and Shanann had OCD, but Shanann more than him. After all, Chris Watts married Shanann. I think he liked cleanliness and neatness to some extent. Not as much as Shanann, but also. Where does OCD come from? Well, it comes from a need to control anxiety. And this is why I've also got I have a different opinion to a lot of people who say Shanann didn't have lupus, because the whole lupus thing introduces that anxiety in the first place. So in other words, whoever you are, if you've got cancer or any kind of terminal disease, you are going to have a fear of life and a fear of death. And you're going to find a way to try and control that fear. And one of the ways you try and control that is by controlling your environment, by having a regimented schedule, by having people do what you want them to do, having things the way you want them to do, have them, having a very clean environment because you're afraid of getting ill, whatever it is. And we know that Shanann's house was unusually ordered. There were a lot of things in containers with labels on them. And above all, the house is very, very clean. But guess what? Who had to clean the house? Who did the laundry? And so a lot of that OCD behavior, which was Shanann's attempt to control her anxiety, was transferred onto Chris Watts in terms of him. He did the laundry. He did a lot of the cleaning of the house. He did a lot of the tidying up of the house as well. And so what is happening when that is happening is that OCD personality from Shanann is being pushed onto, in other words, that anxiety, that control is being pushed onto Chris Watts, and the overall feeling he feels is, well, he's being suppressed, he's being repressed, he's being controlled, he's being suppressed, he's being humiliated. Now, you might not think doing the laundry is humiliating, but doing it every single day and doing it for 3 other members of the family. And it might be that Chris Watts didn't feel like a man. He may have felt like a woman, that he's the woman of the family, and Shanann is wearing the pants and Shanann's the man. I don't know. But I do think that he felt emasculated, and I think he felt humiliated. Now, again, that doesn't mean that because he felt that way, he had the right to do what he did. It doesn't mean that it was Shanann's fault. What is happening here is, obviously, he didn't set boundaries for Shanann, and Shanann didn't. I don't want to give Shanann any blame here, but Shanann could perhaps have thought how he may have felt when this was going on. And in the beginning, I think they got along well. She told him what to do, and he didn't mind doing it. But I think it reached a point where Shanann perhaps told him more and more and more what to do, and he just went along with it to keep the peace. He just, instead of arguing with her, he just did what she wanted. And in that sense, that is his responsibility. And so this brings us to this missing link. So in order to have this sadism, the sadistic act, you need something that's referred to as anality, right? And someone who is anal is someone who's very meticulous about something. So in other words, in these mass shooters, I always saw a very clear link between anality and sadism. So you couldn't have sadism without anality, and vice versa. And then also the proportion would match one another. So in other words, where you have a very, very anal situation or personality, then the sadism would be extreme. And a really good example of that is Adam Lanza at San Diego, a very, very anal fellow, a guy with extreme difficulty just going to school and socializing. And you know, in the same sense with Chris Watts, some of that was coming from his wife. With Adam, a lot of that anality and his response to anxiety was coming from his own mother, who, anyway, we'll deal with that perhaps in a different episode. And so let me just give you a couple of definitions of anality. So the anal personality is a popular term for anal retentive personality. It's marked by excessive orderliness, extreme meticulousness, and often suspicion and reserve. So Shanann was someone who wanted a lot of orderliness and a lot of meticulousness, and that was sort of foisted onto her husband. And I'm not saying that he wasn't like that at all. I think there was quite a lot of that in Chris Watts anyway. But that is kind of where the anal aspect came from. And as I say, it is intended to control anxiety, right? Now, if we take it a step further and we say, what causes sadism, right? And you can go and look at the website, I think it's mentalhelp.net. What causes this? Now, you know, what is really crazy in the Watts case is people are forever looking for disorders. Could it be this disorder? Could it be autism? Could it be Asperger's? Could it be this? Could it be that? And there's a disorder mentioned over and over in the discovery. OCD. The last word in that aphorism is disorder. Obsessive compulsive disorder. There's your disorder, right? If you're looking for a disorder, there's your disorder. And so when you ask the question, okay, what causes sadism? Well, it's unfavorable experiences during childhood or early stages of sexual development. So in other words, think about it. When Chris Watts was growing up as a youth in high school, also when he was trying to become a man, when he was trying to have relationships, he couldn't get sexual pleasure for whatever reason. And so this actually creates a sadistic body in him. In other words, something is primed in him, but it's dormant, right? Now, what is going to activate that thing? Well, something where there's excessive control later on in his life, especially in a scenario where he has access now to the sort of sexual gratification he wants, but that is being terminally and in a kind of excessive way frustrated, and that's exactly what situation he was in, right? So if you think about it, so sexual development is frustrated, and that then creates the body for sadism, and it's seen as one of the major contributing factors in the development of sadistic personality. But I also think his access to sexual development reawakened the sadistic side in him, if that makes sense. And that's why I think, you know, you had the good Chris Watts, and then people thought, wow, who is this guy? And in a way, it'd been there all along, but it had been a dormant side to him, right? Another thing that they talk about here is that sadism or sadistic personality can be developed in an individual through learning. And I think something like an affair is deriving sexual satisfaction in a sense, while causing pain in a kind of a symbolic sense to your family. So the fact that Chris Watts was having an affair while his wife was pregnant, I think gave him a sense of sadistic satisfaction in a way. I think he felt both terribly afraid, but also I think he felt incredibly powerful that he was able to kind of con two women, but also have them both love him at the same time. And while I think that gave him a sense of sadistic satisfaction, he ultimately felt he was in a trap and he needed to get himself out of it. And so the way he did that was through an anal response, which is by committing a crime and then covering it up, right? And a sadistic psychology associated with that. Now, if you think about anality and where it comes from in our psychology, it comes literally from a child that plays with its feces, right? Which is another way of saying playing with death. And you actually have a situation in the Watts case where there are feces, where in the middle of committing the murder, there were feces that he had to pick up. I know a lot of people think it was urine, but it wasn't. Urine wouldn't leave those stains on the pillowcases. So because this is true crime rocket science, I'm sure it'll be quite shocking to some of you. Some of you will not accept this. Some of you will be very upset and say, well, I don't think that is true at all. But when you go and study up on it, and if you want to read some of the books that I've written on the subject, including Slaughter, as I said, I'll put a link in the description. But it is a very interesting link, but as I say, between anality, which is similar to OCD. Being OCD is being anal. So there's a link there between that and the sadism. And so in a broad way, you could say Shanann's OCD kind of eventually reached a level where it eventually activated Chris Watts' sadism, right? And that is the psychological link that we are talking about in Chris Watts' criminal psychology. If you found this discussion interesting, I'm going to be putting up another video dealing with the crucial question we all forgot to ask. And it is just a very simple thing dealing with the night in question, and again the criminal psychology running through that. I do hope that we've been with this case for 2 years, and you may not agree with what I've said here. Maybe it's time to just think about it. Some people have thought in the same rut for 2 years and they still can't understand why what happened. It's because your thinking hasn't changed. So maybe you should just consider another alternative. And the alternative is that there were no accessories. This is purely the criminal psychology of Chris Watts, him and him alone. And it's important that we understand how this happened and not make someone else a scapegoat. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do like, share, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.